Thank you so very much for inviting me here and for hosting me here. And many thanks to all of the organizers and to our host Anya Vlasovic, who did a lot of organizing work. Thank you so very much. So I'll tell two words about myself. So I'm a student, doctoral candidate from New York University, and I'm working on Abraham Miguel Cardozo. Since Abraham Miguel Cardozo is connected to, he's a lesser known person, but he's connected to one of the major figures in Jewish Kabbalah, Moshe Cordovero. This thing is still understudied, and I wanted to talk today about Cordovero. I will mention, however, Cardozo, but the main accent of my lecture will be dedicated to Moshe Cordovero, who is one of the major figures in the history of Kabbalah. And I think it should be also said that he might be once readmitted to philosophical departments, but it is not the case yet. Okay, so dear friends and colleagues, I decided to read this lecture in English so it will be more accessible for a larger audience. However, you're very welcome to ask me questions in Russian or in Hebrew, since I understand this languages pretty well. Questions in Latvian language are also welcome. I speak that language too. Okay, so this question will deal with the question of oneness and multiplicity of God. And the subject is quite ancient. I remember the first instance of philosophic and mystic treatment of this problem in Plato, namely in two of his dialogues. One is Parmenides and second is Sophist. In his dialogue Sophist, Plato tries to ask, what is one? And since one should be in concord with itself, we must ascribe to it only oneness. Should we ascribe to it being as well, it would contradict itself on the basic level, since this one would have two qualities at the same time, oneness and being. Hence, true and simple one must be above being, since being must be one and end exist, but one itself must be only one. From that point of time, the one above being came into the history of philosophy and religion. Later, this one above being, or simple one, met Jewish God, who also claimed to be that he is only one and above everything. It was only a question of time when these two descriptions would become amalgamated into one, in a process which I would like to compare to the fusion reactions, as if two nuclei collided and formed a new and a larger one. However, this new nucleus, hailing from two different traditions, was, so to speak, an unstable isotope, and its half-life was about 400 years. Later, Jewish and Christian authors decided that Greeks and Jews do not speak of the same thing. And so this isotope exploded like a firework. So today, we are going to deal with a previously unnoticed page in the history of radioactive decay of God 238, Moshe Cordovero. In Kabbalah, one faces with a constant problem. God is one, simple and immutable. Nothing is compared to him, and nothing could be done to him. He is the absolute sovereign of the universe, unknowable and indescribable. At the same time, there are numerous entities that are related to him or even constitute him. He has many holy names. According to Kabbalah, they exist as separate entities. He has aspects, 10 Sefirot, and even Partsofim, or divine faces, which were introduced by Luria as divine constellations, which exist separately and could not be reduced to the simple infinity. Moreover, this Kabbalistic God changes over time and cyclically. After the destruction of the temple, God has changed. For instance, his female aspect was banished, and his behavior is different on Shabbats and during Jewish holidays. After the redemption, again, he will change, restoring to his former and primordial glory. So both positions are equally important, and most of the Kabbalists will not give up on either. For some Kabbalists, this is not a problem. They describe God according to both orders, and they feel perfectly comfortable claiming that God is at the same time above all names and entities, and that he has various names and Sefirot and other divine entities. For instance, the beginning of anonymous Sefer Ma'arechet Lohut, which was written somewhere in late medieval period, states that God supervises the being and he is one. However, all the changes that we encounter within him are not ontologically grounded within Godhead. They come only from our perspective. I will read also in Hebrew and in my English translation. Maybe I will be able to post the things in chat, so you will be able to see the text and interpret the text by yourself. Ma'arechet Elohut in the second chapter claims, ושינוי פעולה אשר מצד ההנהגה אינה כי אם מצד המקבלים. And the change in action is only from the perspective of those who receive God's grace. I'm sending it to everyone in chat, please. Okay. Consider another passage from the second chapter. אף על פי שאמר בכל מקום שנאמר אלוקים, זו מידת הדין, ובכל מקום שנאמר השם, זו מידת רחמים. איננו עניין היותו יתברך נחלק בשמותיו, אך כי השמות האלה מורים במקומם על ההשגחה הטובה הייתה מאיתו, אם רעה, רוצה לומר, אם נגזר מאיתו על ברואיו לקבל הטוב בזכותם, או ההפך ברשעים. And despite it is said that all the places that say Elohim, it is the quality midat of judgment, and everywhere it is said tetragram matom. This is the quality of kindness, rahamim. The matter is not that he, blessed be he, is divided by his names, but these names indicate respectively whether it was a good providence or bad one, which means whether it was decreed from him unto his creatures to receive goods for their merits, or the opposite, which is evil, for the wicked ones. And then I paste it into our chat. So if you see the mistakes, you will be able to point them out. Okay, let's continue. When it comes to Sefirot, this anonymous Sefer decrees that there are 10, since he must uphold the tradition of Sefer Yetzirah. Still, he calls them deity and explains the difference between them and God in his unity as a difference between potentiality and actuality. Whether this explanation works or not is far beyond the scope of the present talk. And now I'm only pointing out something different. The differences between oneness and multiplicity within God are solved within the Aristotelian framework of actuality and potentiality. And while the tension between these two aspects in the deity is acknowledged, it is solved in an epistemological manner. The author of Ma'arechet Lohut claims that they are different only in our imperfect perception, but they are all one for God. Of course, it should be noted that this explanation and the explanation that rests with the dichotomy between the potential and actual do not come together nicely. But again, this is a topic for another talk. So I wanted to say that there are two explanations. That one explanation says that the difference in God in simple one God and God as he exists in Sefirot. One explanation says that it is because of our perspective, so it's mitzad mekablim. And second explanation says that it's because of potentiality and actuality. So I would say that these two explanations do not come together, but I suppose this is a topic for another talk. Okay, so these positions that God is only one and simple, and Jewish traditions of names and other mystical and mythical entities hardly come together. And one has to put an effort to make them work together. If God is one and simple, then he cannot have any other characteristics. And in this case, the best way of thinking about him is negative theology. Any claim that he has multiple names or a name must be interpreted that such names or qualities exist only from our point of view, but not in him really. as we just saw from Marechet Elahut. God's multiplicity is nothing but a mirage that we see. This theology, no matter how sublime it is problematic for the Kabbalists, since the Torah and the subsequent Jewish tradition that follows claim otherwise. God has many names, feelings. He dons tefillin. He cries with like a lot of tears. He changes his mind. Of course, all these strange things can be explained. To attain his explanation, Maimonides builds in his guide for the perplexed whole system that, at least on several hermeneutical levels, demonstrates that God is one and simple, and Torah uses multiplicity, corporeality, and anthropomorphism only as a prophetic metaphor, so that simple people who are unable to master the philosophy, be it Neoplatonic, be it Aristotelian, and they cannot grasp the notion of God's simplicity, which is an extremely hard matter, they would still get a correct political opinion nevertheless. These solutions that come from philosophical and mystical departments are often challenges, and sometimes the challenges at first appear to be very subtle and insignificant, yet a closer reading demonstrates some important changes. So we are going to our main dish in Hauptgericht in today's talk. So Moshe Cordovero is one of the early modern authors who stood up against this solution that would render God's multiplicity void. Scholem characterizes Cordovero as follows, I quote, the problem of the relation of the substance of Ein Sof and the organism, the instrument, kelim, which is vessels or bowels, through which it works and acts, was one to which he returned again and again. The intrinsic conflict between the theistic and the pantheistic tendencies in the mystical theology of Kabbalism is nowhere brought out more clearly than in his thought and his attempts to synthesize the contradictions. Not only dominated the speculative side of his thinking, but also produced tentative solutions which are frequently as profound and audacious as they are problematic. I'll post it too. Today, I will analyze one of these profound and audacious and problematic solutions, albeit I will characterize the problem in a different way. While I agree that, philosophically speaking, the tension between the simple one and the biblical God might be characterized as pantheism in the opposition to theism, I wish to put it into a more specific historical context. It is the Neoplatonic element within Kabbalah that faces the biblical and Talmudic legacy. Consider a quite lengthy passage which is central for this article. I mean, told. See it. I will read it in Hebrew and in English, and before I read, I will post it to the chat, so you will be able to follow. Just a second. I'm very sorry. For some reason, it doesn't like to. Okay. This is too large. Okay, this is Hebrew text, I suppose. Hopefully, as full as it can be. And here comes in my English translation. I didn't know about the limitations of Zoom when it comes to pasting large texts. Okay, probably there will be a little bit of a gap, but I hope you will. Okay. אחרי שנתעמתנו בעניין מספר הספרות, ראוי שנחקור אם הן מוכחות מצד החקירה, אם לאו. לזה נאמר כי הן מוכחות מכמה סיבות. הראשונה, מפני שאנו מאמינים בהשגחה ואפילו בהשגחה פרטית. מוכרחים אנו לומר שהוא משגיח מצד הספרות, מפני כי האחד הפשוט, סיבת הסיבות ואלעד האלות, מסולק מן השינוי ומן המידות. רוצה לומר, חם צדיק שומע ושאר התוארים, אשר סלקו ממנו החוקרים. וכן גדרי הגוף והגשמות כגון ירד השם, וכן מראה כבוד השם כאש אוכלת וכולי, וכן ואראה את השם יושב על הכיסא וכולי, וכן כבוד השם מלא את המשכן, וכן ויראו את אלוקי ישראל ותחת רגליו כמעשה לבנת הספיר וכולי, וכן נאמר בדניאל ועתיק יומין יתיב לבושה כפלג החיריו, וכן כתובים באצבע אלוקים, אוזני השם, יד השם, עיני השם, וכעניינים אלו אשר באו בכתוב, המורים על הגבול ועל הגשמות, וכן המורים על התוארים. וזה באחד הפשוט, בערך בחינתו אל עצמותו ופשיטותו, אי אפשר לומר עליו כן אם לא. והנה על ידי המידות יהיו השינויים, והדין והרחמים לא בבחינתו כאשר יתבהר. והנה מפאת בחינה זו, כדי שלא נכחיש עיקרי אמונתנו באחד הפשוט, במציאות פשיטותו, שהוא מסולק מן התוארים המחייבים והגוף והנשמות. אנו מוכרחים להאמין בהשגפתו שגם הוא מעיקרי הדת, ולכן אנו צריכים להאמין בספירות, כדי שלא יהיו עיקרי אמונתנו סותרים אלו לאלו כדפירשנו. And after we have proven the truth of the number of Sefirot, it is suitable that we should study Nachkor, whether they are necessary from the philosophic point of view or not. We say several reasons dictate their necessity. First, we believe in providence and even in personal providence, and we must say He, which is God, supervises the world from the aspect of Sefirot, because the simple one is the cause of all causes and the reason of all reasons. Is cleared, mesulak, of any changes of qualities, which is wise, righteous, hearing, and all other attributes which the philosophers denied of him. And so are the notions of body and materiality, like God descended and the vision of God's glory like consuming flame, and so I got sitting on the throne, and so God's glory filled the covenant, and so they saw God of Israel below his legs, it's like a sapphire stone. And matters like that are written, and they teach us of the limit and of the materiality, and so about his qualities, and about the simple one for the perspective of its essence, and the simplicity. It is impossible to say so or to deny them. So by the power of attributes, there will be changes, and the judgment and mercy from our perspective, as it will become clear. Because of this perspective, which is essence and simplicity, so that the principles of our faith would not contradict each other. And the simple one, as it exists in simplicity, as he is cleared of all the qualities which necessitate body and materiality. And we are bound to believe in the providence because it is also one of our principles of the law, Adam. And therefore we must believe in Sefirot, so that the principles of our faith would not contradict each other. In this passage, Cordovero upholds that there are two orders in Jewish faith and law. First, there is God as a simple one, Ahad HaPashut, and Cordovero assures his reader that the simple one is discovered and described by the philosophers. Second, there is God in the scriptures, and the Jewish law describes him. God has personal providence, which means that he is capable of understanding many details of individual lives. Cordovero describes this problem as pertaining to Judaism, not to Kabbalah specifically. According to Cordovero, God is simple one, is not Kabbalistic work, but something that Judaism upholds as a religion. The same applies to the personal providence, which is God's involvement in people's everyday business. According to the passage we have translated, the Kabbalah, at least in some basic aspects, such as knowledge about Sefirot, changes its function from hidden and secret knowledge to a requirement. One cannot reconcile the tenets of Judaism without knowledge and belief in Sefirot. Cordovero does not invent the term simple one, and most probably he takes it from other philosophic and Kabbalistic texts, probably not from the Neoplatonic text directly. However, if we look at the earlier mentions of the simple one, the texts which speak about it, these texts do not acknowledge the problem of contradiction. They merely state that from the simple one, follows different and time opposite effect, as follow different and at time opposite effects. For instance, in the Book of Principles, Alba mentions several times the simple one and identifies it with the first cause, tracing the ideas to Ibn Sina, Maimonides, and other Muslim philosophers. For him, this difference between the simple one and the multiplicity is also explained through the existence of intermediaries between God and the world. Or, as we just saw in the Ma'arefet Lahut, the problem is acknowledged, but it is solved by applying Aristotelian technical terminology. In other words, for the previous authors, there is no true problem, but only a mirage of a problem, an illusion. We do see God as multiple and changeable, but he is not so. We should start as a philosophy, and the philosophy will become a key to Jewish traditions, mystical and textual. Cordovero's solutions, in many regards, is not so very different. He still admits that God is one, and the multiplicity comes only from our perspective, yet there are several changes to the previous model. First, for Cordovero, Sefirot attributes and qualities exist separately, and they are not just optical problems of our impaired vision. Second, Cordovero swaps the places of philosophy and Kabbalah. It is not the philosophy that rectifies Kabbalistic and biblical inconsistency, but it is Kabbalah and its secret knowledge that rectifies the problem that philosophy just points out. If the previous iterations, philosophy both diagnosed the problem and treated it, now philosophy only does the diagnostic part, and Kabbalah becomes the treatment for the problem of the faith. The final difference is that Cordovero sees faith itself contradicting. He spells out something that previous authors would not dare to say. The principles of Judaism contradict each other, and this contradiction must be taken seriously. We do have a treatment for this contradiction, and it is the Kabbalah and the knowledge about the Sefirot. It is possible that this innovation was connected to two different problems. First, the popularization of Kabbalah. Cordovero's solution is another way to solve inner contradictions within the Judaism, and it positions itself as a common remedy for everyone who believes in the Jewish God and his Torah. Second, since Cordovero admits these contradictions or the possibility of their existence, so he was probably one of the first people to popularize the problem of inner contradiction between God of Israel and the God of the philosophers. His solution stresses on the assumption that it could be solved only if Kabbalah resolves the inner tension between the Neoplatonic simple one and the mystical and mystical Sefirot and names. What would become of a person who would not agree to Kabbalah and would not agree that Kabbalah has any authority to solve these problems? Probably such a person would have to face a deep crisis and would claim that these facets of Jewish faith simply contradict each other, as the whole building of Judaism or the Kabbalah must be rebuilt from scratch or abandoned completely. The latter solution was adopted by Spinoza, and the latter by Solomon Maimon. And later by Solomon Maimon. They both adopt solutions that we should abandon Judaism. So they decided that God of Israel and all his mystical paraphernalia should be abandoned for the sake of philosophy, be it radical unity of Spinoza or Kantian intricacy of Maimon. The former solution, which is that the edifice of Judaism should not be abandoned, but rather rebuilt, was adopted by two other authors who probably never knew about each other, by Blaise Pascal and by Abraham Cardozo. Pascal, in his famous Amulet, writes as follows: the year of great 1654, Mondays, 23rd of November, day of Saint Cunan, the Pope and Martyr. From about 10:30 in the evening until about 12:30, midnight fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers, nor of the wise. Assurance, joy, assurance, filling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ, my God and thy God. Abraham Miguel Cardozo offers a different type of solution. He still takes together Kabbalistic tradition and Neoplatonic philosophical core, but he proposes a meticulous system that explains how these two entities are not one, which is why God of Israel is not the first cause, but they still have place together in this intricate system. And it is no surprise that Cardozo heavily criticizes the previous Kabbalistic tradition and admonishes it of forgetting about true God. I do not wish to say that Cordovero was the key point in the process of the radioactive decay of Neoplatonic biblical God. It might be the case, but I did not provide sufficient evidence to that yet. However, it is quite clear that Cordovero's case was not isolated, and he probably illustrated some important processes that were happening during the early modern period. Thank you. This was a lecture about radioactive God and how he decayed. Now I'm open for the questions, if I still have time for them. And criticism. Если у кого-то есть вопросы, замечания, критика, я буду очень рад.
У меня есть вопрос, я, пожалуй, задам его по-русски, чтобы не мучить всех. Значит, дело в том, что это вот странное соединение между каббалистическим и философским дискурсом, которое, так сказать, сейчас демонстрировалось, оно, как бы сказать, видимо, присутствует, по крайней мере, в каббалистическом-то дискурсе, оно все-таки присутствует даже не в таких сильных случаях, как с Кардозо, потому что какие-то философские понятия все время проникают в язык каббалистов, хотят они того или нет. Но есть обратный случай, а именно случай Спинозы, который вроде бы никаких каббалистических терминов вообще не употребляет, насколько я могу судить. И тем не менее все устойчиво называют его каббалистом. Я имею в виду многие философы, современники и даже современные какие-то исследователи. Вот. И мне хотелось бы спросить, это может вопрос немножечко в сторону, как ситуация с Кардозо помогает нам понять что-то, связанное с самим способом дискурса Спиноза, потому что он, не будучи классическим каббалистом, тем не менее, вроде бы говорит о каких-то вещах, которые каббалисты... Это не совсем в сторону?
Это немножко в сторону, но я буду очень ответить на этот вопрос, потому что, мне кажется, несмотря на то, что он в сторону, это короткая длинная дорога, он схватывает суть проблемы. Вот, спасибо большое за вопрос. Я думаю, что можно ответить на это по следующему образом, что история с Кардозо – это история, действительно история каббалиста, история Спиноза – это все-таки история философа. Но оба этих человека, и, как я хочу показать, Cordovero за примерно, наверное, лет 100 до них, я имею в виду их активного действия, они занимаются одной и той же проблемой, потому что вот этот вот радиоактивный изотоп Бога, который составлен из двух ядер, мистическая, мифологическая, еврейская традиция и неплатоническая, он начинает разваливаться. И есть разные попытки его удержать и попытка его просто развалить до конца, потому что это ядро, оно нестабильное, это нестабильный изотоп. Кардозо, он пытается его схватить, он пытается сказать, что все-таки это одно и то же, как бы мы должны, он не говорит, что это одно и то же, но он пытается их удержать вместе, пытается показать, как хорошо, пусть это не одно ядро, но это очень какая-то такая молекула, в которой эти два ядра очень сильно связаны, что первопричина и еврейский бог, они очень рядом вместе. А Спиноза говорит, что нет, их надо развести, их надо отбросить, одна из них это ничего настоящего, второе ядро, оно настоящее само по себе. Но вглядываясь в то, как они по-разному занимаются одной и той же проблемой, мы можем что-то понять о том, как устроена эта проблема на более глубоком уровне, и, следовательно, что-то понять про то, как Спиноза разбирается с этой проблемой. То есть, вот. Да, это вот мой ответ, наверное, что поскольку они занимаются одной проблемой, то если мы ответим на вопрос, чем же занимается Кардозо и Cordovero, то мы будем лучше понимать бэкграунд Спинозы, и через понимание бэкграунда Спинозы мы лучше поймем его самого. Убедительно? Не уверен.